It's time to talk about the spread of Indo-European and its divergence into subfamilies. So we've been talking about language families and Germanic languages, and this video means to sum this up in historical and geographical terms, and not so much in linguistic terms. What happened that allowed these different groups of languages to come to be used, or rather, what happened to allow Proto-Indo-European to diverge into a large family of diverse languages spoken by diverse populations. How long did it take and everything? How do we believe this works, and how does it look in history? So I'm going to tell this more or less in chronological order. We believe that about 6,000 years ago, roughly 4,000 BC, there was a tribe someplace speaking a language that we're going to call Proto-Indo-European. It had to start someplace, and it became an influential tribe. As I pointed out in other videos, the linguistic evidence points to these people living in a climate and an environment that looks like the area north of the Black Sea, where that, about 6,000 years ago, about where that pink blotch is on the map. And then we can deduce that from the spread of these languages that culture those people carried, and probably many of those people themselves traveled and spread around Europe and Asia. Since we have worked out that linguistic story, archaeology has also provided evidence that bolsters part of this claim. Around the right time period, we find artifacts of material culture, particularly certain and regrettably this map's in Spanish, particularly certain kinds of pottery and certain kinds of burial mounds and certain technologies like early metalworking and chariots that match, and agricultural practices that match the vocabulary of the reconstructed Indo-European language. Those arose in southeastern and then central Europe at the right times for this to have happened. So if you read in Barber, you'll see some references to the Kurgan culture, which has to do with these burial mounds, and you may read about certain kinds of beakers and ceramics. And that's what this map means to summarize for us, that archaeologists observe that a material culture, that is, certain habits of technology and material practices spread across Europe, and particularly across Europe, at the right time to match with our account of Indo-European. Those were probably the people. Now, there are competing hypotheses. Some people think it probably happened in Anatolia, which is now Turkey. It's not improbable. There are also theories that say, my gosh, maybe there wasn't an Indo-European. Maybe we're really looking at a hypothetical middle ground between a couple of languages that converged. And yes, perhaps I suppose so, but those aren't terribly convincing. We can't gather enough evidence to make that happen. Still, we have to remember that this explanation must be a little incomplete and unsatisfying. We can reconstruct Proto-Indo-European, but archaeology tells us that there were people in Europe for physiologically modern humans in Europe for a long time before that, tens of thousands of years. So it's not as though Indo-European was the first language. It certainly wasn't. Something came before it. It derived from something else. But the trail goes cold. We run out of linguistic comparative evidence to do any reconstruction farther back. So the result of that range of cultural movements is that the whole brightly colored portion of this map is now dominated by Indo-European languages. And here we're telling a little bit of an historical story and saying that these are sort of the ancestral homelands. So before the age of global empires, from 1500 or so on, this is where the Indo-European languages lived. Before the discovery of the New World, before Western European conquests in Asia and Africa, this is where Indo-European languages are. And you can see that they go from Sri Lanka down there in the southeast all the way up to Iceland. A few language families don't appear very well here. The Celtic languages are most visible in Brittany, in Breton, that little orange peninsula in France. Of course, they also include Irish, Scots Gaelic, Manx, and Cornish. Cornish is extinct, so's Manx. Welsh is the most vigorous Celtic language, and is barely visible against the red of England. The languages that we're going to worry most about in this class are the Germanic languages, and particularly English among them. Those belong in the territories colored in red, although England's a late addition to this, and Ireland an even later one. We're also going to be thinking a lot about Romance languages, which are the closest influential neighbors. The Celtic languages, of course, are closer, but thanks to politics and power dynamics, less influential. So we will care a lot about French and Latin and Spanish, of course, as we go forward. So we know that it doesn't stop here, right? And furthermore, we also know that Indo-European languages are not the only language family. It happens to be the largest language family in terms of speakers, um, not necessarily, and the most globally known languages, thanks to what's happened in the ages of empire. But there are entire families of languages that can't be connected in any clear way with one another. That is, other independent language families. And here's a rough map of those. It was created by a hobbyist, so I hope you'll, but it compiles some respectable sources. And what you can see here is that there aren't just a few Native American languages. As you know, there are hundreds, and there are dozens of Native American language families that can't be easily related to one another through comparison. And in fact, there are language families in Europe that aren't Indo-European. Look at that little red spot right there at the corner of Spain and France, at the western edge of the Pyrenees. That's Basque. Basque is unrelated to any other language in the world, as near as we can tell. Of course, it's borrowed from other European languages by now, but it is what we call a language isolate. As far as we can tell, the linguistic ancestors of the Basques have been hanging out there in the Pyrenees in the Bay of Biscayne since the Neolithic period, while Indo-European languages rose to dominance all around them. The other non-Indo-European ancestral languages of Europe are extinct. So Etruscan, for example, which was spoken in Italy, is gone. We have writings from them, and inscriptions from them, and writings about them, so that we know where they were there, but nobody speaks it anymore. Hungarian there, by the way, is related to Estonian and Finnish and some North Central Asian languages. It's a Ural-Altaic language, or a Ural language. And Turkish, by the way, is not Indo-European. That territory used to be filled with Indo-European speakers, Kurds and Armenians. It still is full of Kurds, and Armenians and Greeks and Phrygians and all those people named in the book of Acts, if you know the story of Epiphany. They're Indo-European speakers, largely. They're in Western Asia, but cultural migrations and conquests between the 10th and 15th centuries led to a predominance of Turkish in this region. And another important language family I want to direct your attention to for our concerns and our cultural concerns are the Semitic languages, that brown area in North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula in the Middle East. These are called Afroasiatic languages. No, I'm sorry. These are called, they're Afroasiatic languages is one term for it. They're also called Semitic languages, and this family includes Arabic and Hebrew and Aramaic and some other languages of well-known cultural and global importance, not to be overlooked. And so they become an interesting source of borrowings into English. By the way, if I back up one, do notice that Iran there is blue. That's part of the Indo-Iranian languages, a blotch on the map. And Persian or Farsi is an Indo-European language related to Greek and Armenian and Hindi and in fact English at some distance. So one thing this map should make you think about, especially as you look at America there, is what happens when Indo-European languages come into an area and subsume the other languages. And this is a matter of importance for us here in America, but also a matter of importance for us in England, in Europe, because we can predict that if the Indo-European languages spread over Europe, there had to be other people there. right? And they must have been speaking something else. So, in fact, what happens? And here's our map of the world now, linguistically, describing the current state of affairs. We can see that the bulk of North and South America is actually covered in the same seafoam green that indicates the Indo-European languages in the Indo-European realm over there in the so-called Old World. As we know, English, Spanish, and Portuguese predominate in North and South America. And what has happened then is well known in America, in the U.S. English overlays the languages that were here. And as an example, their term for this is to say that English is a superstratum language. It overlays the other languages. And the substratum language will have a limited influence on English, and in fact sometimes end up dying out, as tragically happens. Uh, it then leaves a certain influence on the superstratum language. So, as an example, from the Algic languages, which include Algonquin, English has borrowed words for stuff that exists in the New World: chipmunk, hickory, moose, moccasin, and so forth, tomahawk. Fruits, animals, tools that are characteristic of the New World. Whiskey John is a really interesting one in terms of word formation. That's a reanalysis. This is an imitation of the name of a bird that's really important in Canada, and it's the whiskeycock. But English speakers have imitated that with the English words Whiskey John. It's only an additional irony that whiskey is borrowed from Irish. The same thing has happened at other times in history. We can document it with Latin. When Latin spread over much of Europe, it crowded out and pushed down other languages which were subsumed and ultimately disappeared, but left behind some vocabulary and probably some sound patterning. So the Latin word for horse was equus, but we know that the Romance languages, like these other words, like caballo in Spanish or cheval in French, those give us chivalry and cavalier as English borrowings from French. Those come from a Gaulish word. So the Gallic tribes who used to live there and then got Romanized and learned to speak Latin, they kept their native word for horse, and it persists in Spanish and French and Portuguese. That's a leftover borrowing from a substratum language. This is likely to have happened in the Indo-European expansion too, and in particular it has shaped the Germanic languages, which wandered off. They were spoken by tribes of people who wandered off to North Central Europe, far from the other Indo-European speakers, and the Germanic languages share some vocabulary for stuff that isn't Indo-European. It's not in Hindi and the Romance languages, like ship, sea, and boat. Um, so there, we think this kind of borrowing from substratum languages has happened before. And it's entirely likely that when we look at this map, one influence on the divergence of these Indo-European languages is probably the influence of substratum languages that were subsumed by, well, frankly, populations of substratum languages that were subsumed by the populations of Indo-European speakers and who gradually merged with them, voluntarily or not, I don't know. Probably a little of both, depends on the time and place. As we think about how English and the Germanic languages fit into this, we need to think about the beginnings of our really well documented historical records of Europe, and those start with the expansion of the Roman Empire in the beginning of this era. So by the 180s AD or so, this was the expanse of the Roman Empire, and you'll see that it included England. The Western Empire spoke Latin, as you know. The Eastern Empire mainly spoke Greek, but Latin was known as a second language. And of course, there were already healthy, well-established urban populations in the East, and so those people were able to keep up with their own languages. the the Hebrews didn't give up Hebrew, or the Israelites did not give up Hebrew just because they weren't Israelites then. The Judeans didn't give up Hebrew or Aramaic just because the Romans and the Greeks were there. They maintained a sturdy bilingualism. You know, the same thing happened in Egypt. In the West, the dominance was a little more complete of the Latin Empire, and it's much more likely that local languages were entirely subsumed by Latin. Less so up in Britannia, that is, Britain, where a large Celtic population really only lived under the Roman thumb for a few hundred years, and they were a long way from the Roman mothership. So there was something very civilized going on up there, but it was really a Celtic culture with a Latin overlay. When that fell apart, this is where we get to figure out how English came to England, because I've been talking about Celts, that is ancestors of the Welsh, linguistically and genetically and culturally, and Romans there. There were no English speakers there. There were no Germanic speakers there, not in great numbers anyway. But as the Roman Empire collapsed especially around the year 400, but between the fourth and fifth century, then I hate to say hordes, large numbers of Germanic-speaking peoples out of Northern Europe in different tribes speaking different kinds of Germanic languages out of Proto-Germanic moved into the regions of the Roman Empire and carried their languages with them. As they moved into Italy, they carried that language with them, the Visigoths, and as you'll see, or you've seen in the Codex Argenteus, the Gothic Bible, they developed a literate culture in Gothic for a while, but really eventually they gave that up in favor of Latin and Italian, then Italian culture. The same thing happened in Spain, and of course the Moorish invasions of the 8th century helped that happen. In the case of Britain, it happens that the invasion came pretty late of the Germanic people. The Goths were running around by the middle of the 3rd century. By the 280s, they had an established presence in the Eastern Empire. But it wasn't until the 400s, really, that the Angles and the Saxons began to move into what's now England. So they were speaking Germanic dialects closely aligned with all the other Germanic dialects up there on the North Sea coast, perhaps mutually intelligible and indistinguishable from them, closely related to the language of the ancient Franks, which is Old Saxon or Old Low Franconian. And we know this because of historical records. But at about the year 410, it happens. England was it wasn't England. Britannia was a very civilized place with this map of Roman roads and all kinds of nice Roman cities all over it. But once Gothic, at this point, really Gothic rebels, they had been so involved in the Roman Empire for so long, they were a long-standing presence. But Gothic armies sacked the city of Rome, and really the civic infrastructure began to crumble after 410. It wasn't long after that that the Romanized Britons up there in Britannia asked for help from Rome because these Germanic tribes were coming over the ocean, and Rome wrote back a letter that said, "Gee, we're sorry, you're on your own." And in the coming decades, it happened really very quickly. Within decades, the Germanic presence, the presence of Angles and Saxons who were speaking Anglish, that is English, became very great, and they became the dominant cultural force in southern Britain, all the way up, certainly all that Orange territory, really very quickly. So there's a quick view of how the Indo-European languages diverged and spread. Remember, the basic model is one of both population movement and of cultural transmission. And it's very difficult to disentangle those two things. When we think about the divergence of populations, it's easy to imagine people moving and migrating. But when we think about the divergence of languages, we have to observe that on the one hand, a population can wander off someplace and in isolation their language can develop, as languages must develop, in a way that leads to it distinguishing itself from the other ones. It develops independently and winds up different from the languages of other Proto-Indo-European speaking tribes who went somewhere else. But when but at the same time, if we think about population movement, we have to recognize that these are populations moving into the territory of other peoples. And if Indo-European speakers become dominant there, it's nevertheless likely that they will, on some terms, mix with the local population and absorb some features of their language. And that absorption of substratum features is also another force in language divergence. When populations go off someplace, mingle with, conquer, steal and abduct, whatever, the local population, and adopt some of their speech habits into their language. That speeds up the change, and it's very likely that this happened with the tribes who went off and diverged in Northern Europe in a way that leads to us calling them the speakers of Proto-Germanic. More about that in the near future.